Hi, and welcome back to Chapter 2, Section 4, the Women's Movement in Mr. Snyder's history class. Women, you get about 3 days to yourself in U.S. history, and this is day 1, and I enjoy every single one of them, so let's begin. Your learning targets, have these out in front of you. Don't be afraid to use the pause button. Identify the limits faced by American women in the early 1800s. Describe how women began playing an increasing role in political and economic life, and trace the development of the women's rights movement, which we will talk about at the end of today's lesson. So the major themes we've talked about in this chapter so far are states' rights versus national authority, talked about in the nullification crisis. The sectionalism versus nationalism also is becoming apparent as evidenced by the nullification crisis. And the Second Great Awakening, those religious ideals are starting to shape society as far as the temperance movement, the abolition movement, and also the women's movement grows out of both the Second Great Awakening and the abolitionist movement. So the limitations for women in the 1800s are referred to as what a historian calls the cult of domesticity. And what it means is that the notion that women belonged in the home while the public sphere belonged to men has been called the ideology of separate spheres. In particular, the cult of domesticity is the view that women had a special role to play in the domestic sphere as guardians of virtue and spiritual heads of the home. In the view of most men in the 1800s, a woman's place was in the home and on a pedestal. But the reason for this is that there was a growing division between the working lives of middle-class men and women. In the 18th century and earlier, most economic activity had been centered in and near the home, and husbands and wives often worked together in a common effort. By the early to mid-19th century, or the 1800s, this way of life was declining, especially in the Northeast with the Industrial Revolution. In towns and cities, the rise of factories and counting houses severed the home from the workplace. Men went forth every morning to go to work, leaving their wives at home to tend to the house and the children. Married women were therefore increasingly deprived of a productive economic role. The cult of domesticity made a virtue of the fact that men were solely responsible for running the affairs of the world and building up the economy. And this is a new conception of gender roles, just as our gender roles are changing in the 2000s as they did in the 1960s. They were changing back then, and this pattern was glorified in magazines and new literature that the women were reading. They felt like this is where they belonged. Working class wives were not usually employed outside the home during this period, but they could labor long and hard hours within the household. Besides cleaning, cooking, and taking care of the large numbers of children, they often took in washing or piecework to supplement the family income that the husband had. So that is how they started to get some economic and participate in economic activity during this period. In urban areas, unmarried working class women often lived on their own and toiled as household servants in the sweatshops of the garment industry and in factories. But for middle-class women whose husbands or fathers earned a good income, freedom from industrial or farm labor offered some tangible benefits. They now had the leisure to read extensively the new literature directed primarily at housewives, to participate in female-dominated charitable activities, and to cultivate deep and lasting friendship with other women. So they are able to commiserate with other women if they did not enjoy their lot in life, because women at this time could not own property, they could not hold office, political office, they could not vote, there was essentially no role in the public economic sphere, and they had rare amounts of schooling. So women joined these reform movements through church, and women and children, especially who are victims of alcohol abuse, took this in. And women also worked to end slavery. So you can see these reform movements are all connected. The Second Great Awakening spawned the abolitionist and women's rights movement. So they work in the temperance movement because they are the victims of alcohol abuse, especially with their children, and they also work in the abolitionist movement. Pretty soon, women begin to fight for their own rights as well, because middle-class women start to think about their place and their productiveness in society, and some actually begin working in these new mills and factories in the Northeast to get some economic independence. Some of that money, however, had to be sent home either to their father if they were not married, or their husband if they were. So they begin not appreciating that and not appreciating their place in society. I mean, who could blame them? And the same principles that justify the liberation of the slaves that they're working for also apply to the emancipation of women. So reformers begin to publish their ideas. The Grimke sisters, who we talked about in the abolitionist movement, they are the rebellious daughters of a Southern slaveholder. They see and believe that God made men and women equal, so they should be treated equally in society. Some of these anti-slavery women went further and defied conventional ideas of their proper sphere in society by becoming public speakers, like the Grimke sisters, and they also demanded an equal role in the leadership of these anti-slavery societies. And some of these male abolitionists objected to their speaking in public to mixed audiences of men and women. How sexist. William Lloyd Garrison, came to their defense and helped forge a link between the blacks' and women's struggles for equality. The battle to participate equally in the anti-slavery crusade made a number of women abolitionists aware of male dominance and oppression. For them, these same principles that justified the liberation of the slaves also applied to the emancipation of women from all restrictions on their rights as citizens. In 1840, Garrison's American followers all withdrew from the First World Anti-Slavery Convention in London because the sponsors refused to seat the women in their delegation. Among those women excluded were the famous Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So Stanton and Mott go back to New York and start discussing plans for a women's rights convention. And this campaign for women's rights came to a head at the famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in upstate New York. And they organized a declaration of sentiments that was issued at this first national gathering, just a declaration of what they feel is true. The Declaration of Sentiments issued charged that, quote, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her," end quote. It went on to demand that all women be given the right to vote and that married women be freed from these unjust laws giving husbands control of their property, persons, and children. Rejecting this cult of domesticity within its doctrine of separate spheres, these women and their male supporters launched the modern-day women's rights movement, or the Campaign for Equal Rights for Women. I didn't mean to say the modern day. That starts in the 1960s, but this is the earliest one. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, from then on out, work for women's suffrage, or the right to vote. That's their first big hurdle, is they want the right to vote.